Hey everybody, this is my thoughts on Lichdom Battlemage. This is an action game by Xaviant. I'm guessing I'm pronouncing that right. I'm hoping I am anyway. It was released in August of 2014 for PC and is currently in development for PS4 and Xbox One. It's supposed to release in March. The thing is that I cannot bring myself to play this thing very much, so this is basically a first impressions kind of deal for this particular video. And it's actually kind of sad because this kind of thing was right up my alley, at least I thought it was, considering that you get to be an ultra badass mage and just lay waste to your foes with some particularly powerful spells. But obviously, since this is an MTO rather than a full review, that didn't exactly pan out how I hoped. But first, let's talk about the visuals, and then we'll get into why I couldn't stand playing this very much. The presentation in this game is pretty fantastic for the most part. It does run in CryEngine 3, which means that it is capable of some pretty impressive visuals, and in fact it does capitalize on that quite well. In particular, the particle effects in this game look absolutely stunning at times. But even apart from that, they've got some pretty fantastic environments in this game. Even though the game is extremely linear in terms of the actual level design, the visuals for those levels are downright fantastic, which is pretty much what we've come to expect from CryEngine games, in fact. The environments usually look pretty fantastic in them, and this one is no exception. Where things get a bit more muddy are in the actual character models and textures, which are noticeably lower quality than the environments themselves, so that's somewhat disappointing, but it still doesn't look bad. You can just very easily tell where they put all of their visual budget. At any rate, the sound design is considerably weaker than the visuals. While the voice acting is not downright terrible, the only person who puts in even a remotely decent performance is Jennifer Hale as the female player character. Everyone else seems to be either phoning it in or just hamming it up, and it really does not work out in the game's favor. Sound effects are alright, but they're nothing particularly special, and it's actually pretty disappointing when you have some really impressive visual effects on the spells that you're casting, but they don't sound ridiculously powerful or really weighty with their impacts or anything like that. And then there's the music, which honestly I don't even notice when I'm playing it. I'm just kind of zoning out and drifting in and out of paying attention when I'm actually playing this thing, and the music being kind of generic fantasy music doesn't really help things out. But of course, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and from what I played, the story was downright horrible. It does change up a bit depending on whether you're playing a female or male player character. In my case, I was playing a female character, so what ended up happening was the sister was abducted by a guy named Shax over a piece of jewelry that the player character refused to sell to Shax. And so basically your entire motivation as the female player character is to get your sister back and kick this guy's ass. But regardless of which player character you pick, you're going to get railroaded into becoming the dragon, which is to say that you are the chosen of a guy named Roth, and you are given these magic bracers that give you magic powers and the ability to cast spells. The other character that you didn't pick becomes the person who will aid you and is known as the Griffin. And from there on out, you're basically trying to take down Shax because apparently he has some evil black magic or something like that. I don't know how the plot goes after that, but it completely failed to engross me, and in fact, the more it tried to reveal of the plot, the less I was interested. So I eventually just shut the plot out of my mind entirely and started just going through the game attempting to get engrossed in the gameplay, which was completely impossible. You see, the game advertises you building up a bunch of spells that are basically limitless in potential and limitless in effects. In reality, there's only a handful of effects they can actually do, and they are all very, very bland. You have a spell that you can lob, you have a spell that's a stream, you have a spell that's an area effect, you have shields that you can use. You might be able to lay down a trap spell, but here's the problem with that. I found that the lob spell was the most useful. I ended up just using fire magic the whole time and didn't give a crap about any of the other spell schools that I could be messing around with. And when I started to go into the spell customization stuff, it just completely lost me. I just started clicking buttons, and eventually I was given spells that were slightly better than what I had, and at no point did I ever feel like I understood how the customization system worked. In theory, it allows you to customize your spells and get some really powerful effects out of them, but in practice it's a bunch of mumbo jumbo that you basically need a wiki to be able to sift through. So generally I just ended up going in there and looking for the stats that would be higher than what my current spells were, and it actually took me a long time to find things to replace my old spells. But regardless of what I switched them over to, the effects were still pretty much exactly the same. A lob spell is always going to behave like a lob spell. An area effect spell is always going to behave like an area effect spell. The actual effects those spells have is going to depend on which sigil they are, as well as what various effects have been applied to them during the crafting process, but those are really more just status effects than anything else. And while the game does give you a tutorial of sorts on how to use the crafting system, it's really just how to use the crafting system and not how to actually figure out exactly what you want to do with the crafting system. Explaining how a system works and then just leaving you to figure out exactly what all the stats are and what they actually have an effect on and things like that is really not a good way of handling a tutorial for something like that. All it did was leave me knowing how to use the crafting system and not what anything actually meant, so I just kind of messed around with stuff and was like, okay, is this supposed to mean something different, or is this supposed to be better than the previous spell I had? I really don't know. Let's try it out. Oh wait, it does less damage. Let's go back to the old lob spell again. It's really annoying when you're trying to figure out how to make a really awesome, badass spell, and all you can really do is make a spell that is a slightly better version of the one you've been using for the past 3 hours. And it certainly doesn't help that the components you find scattered throughout the world, as well as through killing enemies, are all pretty much randomized, and they are categorized in the Diablo-esque system of rarities. Oh look, this one's green, that means it's better than this other one you had equipped, or this one's blue, or this one's purple, or whatever it may well be. All it really means are a bunch of stat differences that are going to be more significant the more rare the thing is. And while you can craft them together in a way to create better augments and such, it really becomes very tiresome very quickly, particularly considering that the menus that you're dealing with for the crafting system are really not that intuitive. But as annoying as the crafting system can be, it really wasn't what ultimately broke this thing for me. I can honestly take or leave the crafting system. If it's your thing, then whatever, but I just couldn't sift through it enough to really give a crap about it. What ultimately killed the experience for me was how ridiculously repetitive the game is. The levels themselves are all extremely linear, although they do give you the impression sometimes of opening up, but it's really an illusion. It's either a branch that leads to a dead end, or it's a branch that leads you to the same place that you're going to go anyway. It's just that there might be something else along the way. And as you progress through these levels, you're going to run across a bunch of enemies that will spawn in, and you'll have to fight them over and over and over again until all of them are dead before you can proceed to the next area. This wouldn't really be a problem if the combat were interesting, but it really isn't interesting. You get your 3 spells per sigil, and that's pretty much it. While certain enemies might be more vulnerable to a certain type of attack than others, what I've found was that more often than not I could just get away with spamming this basic fireball attack, and occasionally use the area effect spell I had to decimate my opponents as well, but generally speaking it was all very, very tedious because I was just doing the exact same thing over and over and over again, not really varying up my tactics in any way. What this ultimately meant is that the game just became extremely boring, and since the only real motivation that you have as a player is getting more of these various spell augments and such that are at a higher rarity than the ones you had before, it ultimately falls into the same pit that Diablo clones do, where it's centered more around addiction factor than actually compelling gameplay. A game that centers itself around addiction factor more than anything else will always lose me. I find them ridiculously boring. And this one was no exception. Instead of feeling like a badass mage, I felt like I was just playing a first-person action version of a Diablo clone. And it was to the point where I just can't give enough of a crap to actually be able to do a full-on review or even a normal MTO on this. Let's face it, the thoughts I've put forth in this MTO are mostly incomplete. They're just kind of rambling rambly, and they're what I felt after having played the game. They're certainly not the same kind of thorough examinations that I tend to do for my reviews. It's just kind of rambly thoughts that I put together based on being extremely bored with a game to the point where I'm not going to bother finishing it. And in fact, I'm so bored with it, I can barely even bring myself to get the footage for this MTO, let alone actually go further into the game to get a more complete opinion on the game. Does that make it good or bad? Well, I honestly don't know. I haven't played enough of the game to really be able to assess its full quality. What I can tell you is that it's the exact kind of game that I can't stand playing. The whole thing is basically just a grind, and if that's your kind of thing, if you've looked at this and went, oh, I gotta have me some of that, well, then pick it up, I guess. But if you're more like me and you cannot stand addiction-based gameplay, then you are going to find this a ludicrously boring game. It's really that simple. It's a really hit-or-miss game. Some people it hits really strongly, other people it doesn't. I'm one of the ones where it didn't resonate with me at all. Take that for what it's worth. Thanks for watching.